I'm on my way to the Apartheid Museum. Prior to moving to Joburg, I hadn't realized how many different monuments and museums there are just celebrating our freedom. The Apartheid Museum is one of those. It documents the journey we've taken as a country. And yeah, I'm going to take you guys on a bit of a tour of the museum so that you too can see the history that we are faced with. I think it's relevant now, especially since we are going to be celebrating Youth Day on the 16th of June. Join me. Before I head into the museum itself, I feel it's important for you to understand how much exposure I've actually had to apartheid. I was fortunate. I was raised in the latter years of this terrible time in our history. In fact, my parents did everything they could to kind of protect me and shelter me from the effects of apartheid. There's only one incident I can think of where I wanted to sit on a park bench and my mom actually told me, no, those benches are not for us, it's for other people. That's the only thing I actually remember about apartheid. That being said though, I've been reflecting quite a bit on what I've learned in history. And if I think back now, I didn't learn anything about our country's rich history. So this excursion to the Apartheid Museum is going to be quite insightful for me. If I think about what my 10-year-old is learning right now, she's learning about this stuff. And I never got that opportunity when I was at school. When I was at school, we learned things about the French Renaissance and, you know, the Groot Trek. Those were the things I learned about. So I'm very keen to have a look at how they've packaged our history as a country. Entrance into the museum is via these two turnstiles. As you can see, they are clearly marked white and non-white, which is how our country was set up. It was set up to clearly differentiate between white people and non-white people. When you pay for your ticket, they issue you a random allocation in terms of your race so that you can go through the turnstile of the piece of paper that you've received. It's quite jarring actually, and it brings back quite a few memories of this kind of signage everywhere around South Africa. This was the part of South African history that I never learned anything about at school. As I mentioned before, it was very limited in terms of what they told us. The only thing that I recall is stuff about the Khoisan, the people that were here before the Dutch settlers arrived, and the Groot Trek, the big move from the Cape to Transvaal. That's all they taught us. Nobody actually spoke about how we got to apartheid. How did we get to a point where all the races were divided in terms of where they lived and what they could do? So this visit to this museum was very interesting because I got to see who were the architects, the people that had this brainchild that segregation was a good idea. And those two guys that thought this was a good idea was Jan Smuts and JBM Hertzog. They were leading white politicians in South Africa during those very weird World War years, you know, between 1918 and 1939. Both had served as Afrikaner generals in the South African War, and both were driven by their belief and their vision of a white South African nation, which they tried to entrench by promoting this policy of separating us all along racial lines. If I think back to when Smuts and Hertzog were around, the ideology around segregation was not unique to them and South Africa. I mean, if I think about it, that's how many countries had operated up until that point. That's why we had some of the world wars that we had. The key difference between us and everybody else, though, is that we took segregation to a whole new level by putting it into our laws, by forcibly separating people and using fear and punishment as a way to enforce it. The even weirder part of our history is that at that time, when we started implementing these laws to govern segregation, many countries were moving away from racially segregation kind of lines. They were trying to get rid of it, and here we were trying to reinforce it with the laws of the country. As you can see, for us to entrench apartheid or separateness, we had to change and implement a whole lot of new laws. You can see on that back wall all the laws that we had to put in place to ensure that we could keep everybody separate. There were a ton of laws that were passed in the creation of apartheid and, to make sure that we stay segregated. But there are a few of these laws which could be considered as the pillars on which apartheid rested. The very first one is the Population Registration Act of 1950. This act demanded that people be registered according to their racial group. This meant that the Department of Home Affairs would have a record of people according to whether they were white, colored, black, Indian, or Asian. People would then be treated differently according to the population group they were assigned to. So this law essentially forms the basis of what was then known as apartheid. There was some teething problems in deciding which people sat with which racial group, but that's a discussion for another day. The second notable law that was passed was the Group Areas Act of 1950. This was the act that started physical separation between the races, especially in urban areas. The act also called for the removal of some groups of people into areas set aside for their racial group. Promotion of Bantu Self-Government Act of 1959 said that different racial groups had to live in different areas, and only a small percentage of South Africa was left for black people, who, as you know, comprise the vast majority of our population, to form what they called homelands. This act also got rid of black spots inside white areas by moving all black people out of the city. These black people were then placed in townships outside of the town. They could not own property here, only rent it, as the land could only be white owned. This act caused so much hardship and resentment. People lost their homes, were moved off land they had owned for many years, and were moved to underdeveloped areas far away from their place of work. The 1970s as a whole, I feel like, was a pivotal time in our country's history. It was the time when the movement, the Black Consciousness movement, was beginning to get widespread popularity, and lots of students of that time were beginning to feel critical of the apartheid government because of all the things that they've tried to do to kind of squash them and make them feel as though they are not worth anything. This was particularly evident in schools, in high schools in the Soweto area. Lots of their teachers were beginning to encourage them to voice their opinions and let the government know their dissatisfaction. We cannot deny the major impact and significance of the events that took place on the 16th of June 1976. It was essentially the day that the black youth stood up and said, "We have actually had enough. We are tired of being oppressed by a government who thinks that we are inferior." Although there aren't very many reports on what actually happened on that day, it's been reported that between 3,000 and 10,000 students, mobilized by the South African Students' Movement Action Committee and supported by the Black Consciousness Movement, marched peacefully to demonstrate and protest against the government and just their very oppressive laws. The march was meant to end at a rally in Orlando Stadium, but on their way there, they were met by heavily armed police who fired tear gas and later live ammunition on demonstrating students. If the reports are to be believed, about 600 people lost their lives because the police were just shooting at them, most of them kids. This reaction resulted in a widespread revolt that turned into an uprising against the government. While the uprising may have begun in Soweto, it quickly spread across the country and carried on until the following year. The obvious consequence of all of this is that the apartheid government received quite a bit of political backlash because images of the police firing on peacefully demonstrating students led an international revulsion against South Africa as finally its brutality was exposed. This led many people to realize that many black South Africans, that we were not in this by ourselves, that we had support from many different places. And I think allowed us to confidently stand up and say, till here and no further. I am so eternally grateful to those who sacrificed so much for my freedom and the freedom of my kids. And I would love to expand more on this topic. So if that sounds like something you'd be interested to know more about, please pop a comment in the comment section below. And I'll continue chatting about our very rich history as a South African country, because there's lots to unpack about how we got to where we are right now. Thanks for joining me and for listening till the end. I hope to see you in my next video.